In this video, we're getting into something that isn't exactly part of the research process, like the data collection or analysis, but it's still a really important step that I would urge you to at least consider or answer some of the questions to see if it's a necessary step that you'll have to take. And so these are the ethical considerations, and ultimately those are in place to make sure that your students or their parents or administration or whoever your intervention strategy is directed towards, those people are protected and their safety, their well-being, ultimately you're not taking advantage of them. So this whole topic is ethics, and in my own experience, I've had kind of a negative attitude towards the ethical procedures because they're super important, but I've always experienced them as inhibiting my own research process. The research that I do seldom puts people in any sort of harm. Like, the closest thing I've done is asked college students to reflect on periods where they felt anxious. And so it wasn't even putting them like into an anxiety-provoking situation. But still, I'm one person, and I may not have the best perspective when it comes to understanding the potential risks and disadvantages students may face participating in my research. So I've got a couple of questions for you to consider. And if you answer yes to any of these, then if you are conducting classroom research, you'll probably want to go through some ethical channel. If you're part of a university, then you have access to an institutional review board, and there's a whole procedure, I imagine, you can follow through them. If you are in a school district and you're just doing classroom research for yourself or for your community, there may be, like, the superintendent may have, or the entire school district may have an institutional review board. Even if it's just one person who's going to review what you plan on doing, it's great to just check that box to make sure that you've gone out of your way to protect potential participants in your study. So let's take a look at some of this. Some of these examples. Do you need ethical review? So the very first item there is, do you plan on using the information you get for publication? And if so, and that could be a presentation, and by publication it's just making public your research. So if you plan on presenting it at a conference, or even presenting it to the university, especially if it's being recorded, posting it on a blog, posting it or making quotes available on Twitter or Instagram, recording footage and posting it to Facebook, all of these require ethical review because your students are learning in the classroom environment, and the understanding is what they learn there gets to stay in the classroom environment. And if you're, it wouldn't be ethical for you to take a student's exam grade or maybe their essay and post it on Facebook and say, look at how great my students are learning. Even if you don't use the student's name, you're taking something that they gave to you confidentially, protected by the learning environment, and you're publishing that. You're making it public without their decision there. You didn't consult them. So for me, when I collect data and analyze it and do like a formal study, I'm generally planning on publishing it. Like, I want it to be printed in a journal. I want to present it at a national or regional conference. So if I'm conducting classroom research, it would be wise for me to go through the ethical review board, and the ethical review board may actually say, yeah, that sounds perfectly safe. Let's just expedite it. I get it back in a day. But sometimes I find out that, okay, there was something I overlooked. All right, so that's one. If it's going to be published, yes, absolutely. Will students be unsafe? That might be a really quick one for you to answer. Are you going to subject them to something that is potentially unsafe? Are you going to try something new that may have negative consequences? Could this backfire? If you're unsure, go through IRB. But if you're reasonably sure, or if you know that students will not be unsafe, then you're good. You don't have to do ethical review board. Moving on, could it be unbeneficial? So that's a little bit different from is it unsafe? If you were testing a new teaching strategy and you actually thought that it wouldn't work, but you wanted to know for sure, maybe it's a new fad that's going through school districts and you just want to test it to kind of convince yourself that it doesn't work. It would actually be unethical for you as a teacher to implement a teaching strategy that you believed to be unhelpful, or if you were completely unsure if it would be helpful, then you would want to make sure that you're giving that to an ethical review board so they can review, all right, are you deliberately wasting students' time or having them learn something that's not going to help them? So there could be some ethical concerns there, but chances are you're not going to test a strategy that you believe to be unhelpful. So that brings up the next one. Are you using a control group or are you doing an experiment? And so maybe in one section of a class, you do this new teaching strategy that you believe is going to be effective. Therefore, it would not be unethical for you to do the best teaching strategy that you can give. But if you have a control group where you're deliberately giving them a less optimal version of teaching, which you'll be using as a control to test whether or not the improvement is attributed to the new strategy you're using or just by virtue of students being in a classroom for however many hours. So if you're using a control group, then you're deliberately subjecting at least half of the students randomly to a less optimal learning experience. Therefore, that would be unfair, it'd be unbeneficial for them, and you would need to go through ethical review. If you're just doing classroom research, you're trying a new teaching strategy, and you're going to do a pre-test and post-test and collect the data and use that data to see whether or not your new strategy was effective, and you're going to keep it in the classroom, you're going to keep it in the school district, it's not going to leave the confines of your educational unit, then you're good. There's no reason to do ethical review. For me, my big red flag is if I plan on using it for publication. There typically isn't, I don't check yes to any of those other ones, but if I plan on publishing something, then I will be using data generated from the classroom for reasons other than learning. So it'd be for maybe testing a teaching strategy, which is often the case in what I do, or a new committee work strategy. So I should be doing that for most of my classroom research. There are some studies that I've done that I never really expected to do, or I was doing as part of an institute, and we gave presentations within the institute, and then those ended up getting published. We did not go through IRB for that, and that was unfair. That in retrospect, we probably should have, but we were doing what we believed. Well, perhaps it had gone through IRB because it was grant funded. So, but even still, I wasn't I didn't write that application, even though I was the one collecting the data. So I think my attitude on ethical review has changed quite a bit. When in doubt, go through ethical review. It's obvious if you're doing a laboratory research, but there's kind of a gray area when it comes to classroom research. So if it's going to stay in the classroom, no need to do IRB. But if you plan on taking it outside of the classroom or subjecting students to something that may not be productive for them, you're better off going through IRB. And if you're working with kids, which is probably the case if you're in K through 12, there's this thing called assent, which means that kids, minors, can only give assent. They can't give consent because they're minors. So there's often another step that needs to be taken where parents are involved. But again, the IRB group will be able to help you navigate that. So there's a couple extra steps when you're dealing with minors. So what all is included if you go through IRB? Well, your students will be protected. There'll be consent or assent, as I mentioned earlier. The participants, your students, will have the opportunity to withdraw. So if you're doing, let's say you're collecting essays to test a new teaching strategy, if you plan on studying those results, that would mean that students, if it's going to be used as data, students have to have the option of withdrawing their work from the study. Like they have to have that opportunity, have that option, or be given an alternative assignment. It's just empowering to participants in research. So this is following on the heels of decades where research participants were taken ruthless advantage of. So we give that open space for students to, or rather for participants to withdraw. Also, in the history of primarily social psychology, deception was used. So in the classroom, you might have like an activity that does one thing, but really you're testing something else. And so maybe you're deliberately deceiving them in order to test what their natural reaction might be. But if deception is being used and students are unaware of that, then you just want to make sure that you're not taking unfair advantage of them or getting them to do something that they're not comfortable with by tricking them. Like that's dangerous area or a dangerous place to be. So you'll want to, the IRB will help you avoid that, or at least help you develop a significant justification. And then finally, once you have the data, what are you going to do with it? How are you going to keep it safe? With internet and how easily things can be hacked, it's difficult to protect data. So ultimately what you're doing is creating strategies to protect data if there is a data breach. So the way that you handle it is really important. The way that you title it and designate it and de-identify the participants' names, all of that's really important. So ultimately you're protecting the participants, which in this case are probably going to be your students. And that is it.